The air was too still. Evelyn Boone had lived in Silver Hollow long enough to know what that meant. Wind always carried something pine scent, a whiff of distant smoke, the sharp bite of oncoming weather. But this felt like the breath had been sucked from the land. She stood on the porch, baby Grace nestled against her chest, and stared at the horizon where the sky was turning the color of bruised peaches. That wasn't sunset. That was firelight. Reed had left 3 days ago for Laramie Ridge, riding hard to fetch medicine and seed. The plan was simple. He'd be back before the week ended. Evelyn had counted on that promise. She'd counted on a lot of things, like the burn season staying to the south and the hills staying green through August. But Silver Hollow had a way of rewriting plans without asking for permission. She stepped down from the porch and tightened the baby sling. Grace's soft breaths warmed the crook of her neck, calm and unaware. The barnyard was quiet, except for the creak of the windmill and the occasional rustle of Milo, their old gray donkey, shifting in the shade of the shed. Evelyn had grown used to his silence. Milo didn't bray unless there was a reason. He didn't need to. That's when she saw it. A strip of fire cresting the eastern ridge, fast, bright, unnatural. It moved like a thing possessed, alive and hungry. Her heart hit her ribs like a hammer. That ridge was 7 miles away, and the wind was headed west. Panic hit, but not in a flailing way. It was sharper than that, practical. She turned on her heel, bolted inside the house, and grabbed what she could. Water canteens, a bundle of jerky, a box of ammo, though what she might shoot at, she didn't know. She found the thick wool blanket from their bed and laid it on the floor, placed Grace in the middle, and began wrapping her with practiced hands. The baby stirred, let out a small sound, but didn't cry. "Good girl," Evelyn whispered. "You stay brave for Mama." She could already feel the heat shifting. The wind had turned. Embers would ride it like devils on horseback. The sky outside was going orange-gray. She had minutes, maybe less. She glanced toward the back room where the strongbox was kept. Deed papers, cash stash, the only photograph of her mother left in the world. But it might as well have been buried in the snow for all the good it did her now. Then her eyes locked on Milo. He stood near the corral gate, ears forward, alert, watching her. No rope, no harness, just watching. And for one insane second, the idea came so clear, so complete, it might as well have been whispered into her ear. She grabbed the blanket-wrapped baby, ran for him. "Milo," she gasped, voice cracking. "I need you to do something I have no right to ask." The donkey didn't move. He simply looked at her with that same steady gaze he'd had since the day they brought him home. Like he'd seen worse than this, and somehow he was still standing. She folded the blanket tighter around Grace, then tore 2 strips from her apron and tied them around Milo's chest and midsection, creating a cradle between his shoulders. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't safe. But it would hold. The baby let out a whimper. Evelyn kissed her forehead. "You go now, Milo," she whispered. "Take her to the creek. Find shade. Find shelter. Don't look back." Milo shifted his weight as if considering. Then, without command, he turned west toward the low creek bed that ran parallel to the hill and began walking, slow and sure. Evelyn fell to her knees. Smoke poured into the yard now, black and choking. The sky roared. The eastern fence caught with a hiss. One moment it stood. The next, it was a torch line. Her home, the one she and Reed built with bare hands and sunburned skin, was about to vanish. She stood, stumbled once, and turned toward the house. There were things she could still grab. But her baby, her child, was out there with a donkey who seemed to understand more than he ever should have. She watched Milo disappear into the wall of smoke. the blanket barely visible against his flanks. She had no proof he understood her words, but she'd seen it in his eyes. He knew what he carried. Evelyn Boone burst through the cabin door just as the roof began to groan overhead. Heat slammed her in the face like a fist, and she dropped to her knees without thinking, crawling low beneath the thick smoke that had swallowed every room. The baby was gone. Milo was gone. All she had now was time measured in minutes, maybe less. She reached the pantry where they kept the strongbox, her eyes streaming, her hands blistering as she wrestled it loose from behind the half-collapsed shelf. It wasn't light. Steel and oak and hope. Everything they owned that wasn't burning. She didn't dare look back. By the time she staggered out into the yard, the flames had reached the porch. The east side of the cabin had already collapsed inward, embers spinning like fireflies on the wind. The smoke turned the sun into a pale coin behind shifting clouds of ash. She coughed hard, dropped to one knee, and blinked through the haze. The corral was empty. No Milo, no Grace. The only thing left behind were hoofprints, clear, deliberate, leading west toward the hills and the creek that sometimes flowed strong in the spring, but now was little more than a shadow of itself. Evelyn's breath hitched. Her knees gave out and she hit the ground, clutching the box to her chest. Somewhere inside her, the last rational voice screamed to stay, to dig a hole, to bury herself until the fire passed. But that voice didn't carry her daughter's heartbeat. That voice didn't see Grace's eyes disappear into the smoke. She got up. Her boots crunched on scorched earth as she followed the prints. The wind howled past her, carrying the crackling sound of trees bursting into flame on the ridge behind. Everything smelled like pine pitch and death. Still, the hoof prints led on one after the other, spaced just enough apart to show Milo was walking, not running. Calm, focused. She clutched the strongbox like a child clings to a teddy bear, shifting its weight from hand to hip to shoulder as she moved. Her burned hands throbbed. Her lips cracked. But none of that mattered. Only the trail, the pasture was gone. Fields of brittle stalks had become blackened mud. The fence line lay in pieces, some still smoldering. At one point, Evelyn paused near a pile of debris where a bird feeder used to hang. There, in the ash, Milo's prints stopped, circled, pressed deeper. He'd waited. She knelt and placed her hand in the hollow his hooves had made, imagining him shifting side to side, checking the weight on his back. Grace had been here, still breathing, still safe. "Please," she whispered, "keep going, boy." She stood and continued. Time slipped sideways. The sun hung low behind the smoke, making it hard to tell morning from evening. Her clothes clung wet with sweat and soot. Every breath tasted like bark and copper. But she moved. Because years ago, Evelyn had lost another child. A boy, born too early. She'd held him just long enough to know the color of his eyes before the light left them. She remembered burying him behind the first garden she ever planted and swearing never to love that deep again. But Grace had broken that promise with her first laugh. And now she was out there, somewhere past the ash. The trail narrowed as it led to the creek, once wide and generous in spring, now reduced to a muddy ribbon twisting through gray rocks. And there, beyond the bend, stood the cottonwood grove, or what was left of it. Her heart sank. Flames licked high into the trees, their massive trunks shrouded in smoke. The fire had jumped the ridge faster than anyone expected. The sky above the grove pulsed with orange light, and still Milo's prints led in. She froze, hands shaking, lips dry. This was the place they were supposed to be safe. A shaded grove near water, a last refuge. It was gone. But just as the first wave of despair pulled at her, she saw something odd and something wrong with the pattern of the smoke. It was moving rhythmic. pause, then again, a bray. Milo, not screaming, not panicked, just calling. Steady, urgent. Her heart leapt. She dropped the strongbox, fell to her knees, pressed her face to the earth and sobbed, just for a moment. Just to feel again. Then she wiped her face with the sleeve of her soot-streaked shirt, stood, and stepped forward into the fire-lined path. Grace was alive. Milo was still calling, and she would follow them into the blaze if it meant one more chance to hold her child again. The grove was burning, and somewhere inside it, her baby and that donkey were waiting. The smoke pressed against Evelyn's skin like wet wool, suffocating and hot. The world had turned the color of rusted iron, every shape distorted by flame and shadow. She kept low, skirt damp from creek water, arms out for balance, one foot searching for solid ground as she moved through the trees. Above her, cottonwood branches cracked and groaned under the weight of the fire. Burning leaves swirled around her like ash-colored snowflakes. And still, Milo called, not in terror, but with purpose, like he knew she needed a signal to follow. A mother needed to find her child. She reached the edge of a clearing and paused behind a half-burned juniper stump. Through the haze, she spotted movement. Just beyond a fallen log, down in a natural hollow near the creek's bend, stood Milo. The donkey was broadside to her, gray hide streaked with soot, his head held high despite the chaos. At his feet, wrapped tight in that wool blanket, was Grace bundled like a seed in spring. Small, pink, impossibly still. Evelyn didn't breathe until she saw the rise and fall of her daughter's chest. She stumbled forward, stumbling once on a tangle of roots, catching herself just before crashing headlong into the hollow. Milo turned slightly at the sound, but didn't move away. He watched her approach with those calm, knowing eyes. The fire still raged through the tops of the trees, but the hollow blessed by the creek's curve and the protection of thick old roots was untouched. For now. Evelyn dropped to her knees beside Grace and gently pulled the blanket aside. The baby blinked up at her, eyes damp but clear, cheeks flushed from the heat but unburned. "You little miracle," she whispered, voice cracking as her fingers traced the soft curve of Grace's cheek. She pressed her forehead to her daughter's, letting the child's breath steady her own. Then she turned to Milo. "You found this place," she said, tears smudging the ash on her face. "You brought her here." Milo stepped back, just enough to let her fully cradle Grace. Then he looked up, past the creek, past the trees, ears twitching. Evelyn followed his gaze. Across the creek, partially obscured by rock and smoke, was a ridge steep, jagged, but higher ground. And just at the base of that ridge, tucked behind a curtain of stone and bramble, she saw it. A cave. Her breath caught. A real cave. Not one she'd known about, not one listed on any map. Just a dark slit in the cliff face, hidden from the usual trails. Milo shifted again, stepping forward, then back, glancing between her and the water. He wanted her to follow. The fire wasn't going to spare this hollow forever. Already new tongues of flame were crawling along the forest floor like snakes. The wind was turning again. Evelyn stood, rewrapped Grace securely, and looked at the creek. It wasn't deep, but the current had picked up. Snowmelt from higher elevations, likely. It wasn't going to be easy with the strongbox or with a baby. But Milo had made it once. He could make it again. She knelt beside him, gripping the wool ties from before. "One more time, old boy," she said, voice low and reverent. "Take her across. Get her to that cave." Milo dipped his head slightly, then knelt just enough for her to position Grace. She fastened the straps tighter this time, tearing strips from her already tattered overskirt for reinforcement. Grace let out a soft protest, but then went still, as if sensing her mother's resolve. Milo stepped into the creek. The water rushed up to his knees, then belly. His hooves found solid stones beneath the surface, and his body stayed firm and balanced despite the push of the current. Evelyn moved alongside, dragging the strongbox behind her, her boots slipping every third step. She went under once just for a second, and when she surfaced, Milo was almost to the far bank. "Go," she shouted. "Take her to the cave." Milo did exactly that. He climbed the opposite bank slowly, but with purpose, careful not to jostle the child on his back. Then, once on level ground, he turned toward the ridge and disappeared into the smoke-curtained mouth of the cave. Evelyn gritted her teeth and heaved the strongbox behind her as she crossed the final few feet. A burning cottonwood crashed behind her with a deafening roar, sending sparks dancing into the air. She clawed her way up the rocky bank, lungs screaming, arms trembling. Every inch of her body wanted to give in. But then she saw the cave's opening, and Milo standing just inside. She followed on hands and knees, dragging the strongbox behind her with one final cry. Inside, the air was cooler, still thick with smoke, but breathable. The cave opened into a natural chamber, wide enough for all three of them. A shaft of light pierced the ceiling from a crack above, casting dusty golden beams onto the dirt floor. Water trickled nearby, feeding a shallow pool that had collected in a stone basin. Grace was lying on a folded saddle blanket now, cooing softly. Milo stood beside her, as still as a statue, flank rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. Evelyn collapsed beside her daughter, too spent to speak, too full of gratitude to cry. The fire would pass. It would burn what it could. But it would not reach them here. Not in this hollow of earth. Not under Milo's watch. And as she lay there in the dirt, her baby warm against her chest, Evelyn realized the miracle wasn't survival. It was trust. Morning came, not with light, but with silence. The roar that had chased them into the cave had quieted sometime in the night, replaced by the eerie hush of a world scoured by flame. Evelyn Boone stirred from where she dozed on the cave floor, her back stiff and her clothes stiff with ash. Beside her, Grace slept curled in the crook of her arm, peaceful as a child could be after being carried through fire by a donkey and tucked into a cave while the world burned. Milo stood at the entrance, unmoving. A gray sentinel, alert, ears forward, body rigid but calm. He hadn't slept, not really. Every few minutes he'd shift slightly, sniff the air, or reposition his hooves to keep watch on mother and child. He didn't bray, he didn't flinch. He was simply present. Evelyn sat up slowly, brushed soot from her daughter's cheek and whispered, "We made it." Outside, daylight filtered in weakly, casting strange orange hues through the ash-filled sky. Smoke still hung heavy in the air, but it wasn't thick anymore. It was residual. The fire had moved on. Evelyn stood, legs shaky but determined. She stepped past Milo, rested a hand briefly on his shoulder, and emerged from the cave. What lay beyond nearly dropped her to her knees. The valley was black. Trees she'd grown up beneath now stood as charred skeletons. The hills were bare, the grass singed to stubble. Her home, though unseen from this distance, was somewhere back in the burned scar, likely nothing more than embers and memories now. She turned toward the west, following the sound of hooves. At first, it was faint, just a rhythmic clatter through scorched terrain, but it grew louder, closer. Then she saw them. 5 riders, their silhouettes appearing through the thinning smoke like figures from a dream. They rode slow and careful, scanning the burned hills for any sign of survivors. Leading them was Silas Garvey, a rancher who lived a good 10 miles down the basin. He was the kind of man who spoke little, worked hard, and believed in helping without needing thanks. "Over here," Evelyn shouted, waving her arms, her voice hoarse. The riders reined in and turned as one. When they saw her standing on a ledge with a baby on her hip and a soot-streaked donkey beside her, they stared in stunned silence. Silas urged his horse forward to the base of the rock outcrop and squinted up at her. "Evelyn Boone, that you?" "It's me." "My God," he muttered. "We figured you were gone. That fire tore through your place like the devil himself. We saw nothing left." She nodded. There wasn't. Silas looked at Milo, then Grace, then back to Evelyn. "How'd you get over here? That ridge is steep. And with a baby?" Evelyn swallowed, looked down at Milo, who still hadn't moved. "He brought us," she said. Milo did. There was a long silence. The men exchanged glances. One of them, a grizzled hand named Amos Quill, scratched his beard and said, "That donkey?" Evelyn nodded. "He found the creek, found the cave, kept her safe." None of them spoke for a beat. Then Silas dismounted, pulled a rope from his saddlebag, and said, "Let's get you down." It took time. They anchored the rope to a boulder and helped Evelyn and Grace across the slick stone and down to the ash-coated ground. Milo followed on his own, picking his way down the slope with the same quiet focus he'd shown since the fire began. Once on solid ground, the men crowded around, pressing water and jerky into Evelyn's hands, shielding Grace from the sun, asking 1,000 questions at once. But Evelyn only looked for one face. "Reed?" she asked Silas. "He's safe," Silas replied. "Been tearing himself apart trying to get back to you. Fire cut him off at the canyon pass. He's in Laramie Ridge, sent us out at first light." Evelyn closed her eyes, the wave of relief hitting so hard it almost buckled her knees. Later that day, in the settlement, word spread like wildfire in reverse fast and wide, but bringing hope instead of fear. The story changed a little with each telling. Some said Evelyn rode the donkey herself, baby clutched tight. Others claimed Milo had been trained by mountain monks or blessed by some backwoods preacher with a gift for prophecy. But what stayed true, what no one could deny, was this: a mother trusted her child to a donkey, and that donkey delivered her through a fire. When Reed Boone saw Evelyn step off the wagon with Grace in her arms, he fell to his knees. He didn't speak, just held them both like they were breath itself. Evelyn whispered in his ear, "She's safe." Because of Milo. The next day, folks started showing up to see the donkey. Children brought apples and daisies. Ranchers clapped him on the side like he was a prize stallion. Old women whispered blessings. Milo stood through it all with the same calm demeanor, flicking his tail at flies and watching Grace with an eye that never left her too long. A week later, a reporter from the Cheyenne Gazette came to interview Evelyn. He took notes on a pad with a chewed pencil, asked thoughtful questions, then finally said, "Do you think it was instinct? Or something more?" Evelyn looked across the yard, where Grace sat in the dirt piling stones into tiny towers, while Milo stood nearby, unmoving, casting a long shadow over her. "I don't know," she said. "But no one trained him to do what he did, and he did it anyway." The first frost came early that year, dusting the edges of the new roof in silver. Evelyn Boone stood on the front porch of the rebuilt cabin, her arms wrapped around Grace, who was now 10 months old and heavier with each passing week. The child squirmed in her mother's embrace, eager to explore the patch of earth that was slowly becoming home again. Behind them, the land was still scarred from the fire-blackened tree trunks, ash-crusted fences, a pasture trying to turn green again, but a new wind carried the scent of pine and promise, They had rebuilt faster than anyone thought possible. Reed had returned from Laramie Ridge with half a dozen neighbors and a supply train that didn't stop moving for weeks. Every plank nailed into the new walls, every shingle laid on the roof, every load of water drawn from the closer well bore the mark of community and survival. They rebuilt with fewer frills and more thought, and this time, a storm cellar was dug. The corral was moved within sight of the cabin, and the well stood just 20 paces from the kitchen door. And Milo's new shelter well, that was something else entirely. It stood just beyond the edge of the vegetable garden, under a cottonwood that had somehow survived the flames. Bigger than a normal stall, open on 3 sides, with a sloped roof and a thick bed of hay replenished every morning. Milo didn't ask for it. He didn't seem to notice it was special. But Evelyn did. It was the least they could do. The donkey had become a legend. Strangers came from towns they'd never heard of. Some brought letters, some brought sketches of donkeys drawn by children who had heard the story of the fire. Reporters came too with cameras and notebooks, wanting to hear it in Evelyn's words. She told it simply, every time. No dramatics, no embellishments, just the truth. She'd trusted Milo with her child, and he hadn't let her down. What no one saw was the quiet routine that had settled between Milo and Grace. Every morning, as soon as Evelyn opened the cabin door, Grace would toddle barefoot toward the donkey's shelter, clutching a blanket or a piece of bread. And Milo would meet her halfway. He never wandered far, never let her too close to the woods. If she got near the tool shed or the old well, he'd gently nudge her back with his nose, like a wrangler with a wayward calf. Reed watched it all from the porch one morning, sipping coffee from an enamel mug. "I've seen war horses trained for a year that don't have half the sense that donkeys got," he muttered. Evelyn smiled, but said nothing. She'd written a letter weeks before, sealed and mailed to her old veterinary mentor back in Missouri. She never got a reply. Maybe the woman had moved. Maybe the story was too far-fetched, but Evelyn didn't care. The act of writing it had been enough. "Turns out," she had written, "the best protector I ever worked with didn't wear a badge or a brand. Just long ears and a heart bigger than the fire." They planted trees that fall saplings from a nursery 2 counties over. Evelyn insisted they place one on the ridge above the creek, near the cave where they'd taken refuge, another in the center of the pasture, where the old cottonwood had once shaded the garden, and a third outside Grace's window to grow with her as she did. The days were shorter now. The sky took on a pale sheen just after supper, and Grace fell asleep earlier, tuckered out from her wanderings and babble. Evelyn would sit on the porch in the evening with Reed beside her, and sometimes Milo too, never tethered, always choosing to stay close. One evening, a preacher rode through on his way north. He stopped to water his horse and stayed for supper. After the meal, sitting by the fire, he leaned forward and said, "That donkey of yours, folks say God sent him to save your baby." Evelyn smiled gently, handed him a fresh cup of coffee, and looked across the yard where Milo stood, half dozing under the stars, Grace curled up in the hay at his side, her head rising and falling with his breath. "I don't argue with folks," she said. "But if you ask me, he didn't need heaven's help to know what mattered most." The preacher didn't press. When winter finally set in, the cabin held strong. The new stove warmed the whole house. Grace had her own small crib now, and Evelyn often woke in the middle of the night just to watch her breathe. The fear hadn't fully left her. It probably never would. But in its place was something steadier, a sense that life, even when tested by fire, could be rebuilt. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer in the rebuilt kitchen, Evelyn found the old wool blanket. the one Grace had been swaddled in when she handed her to Milo. It was singed on one edge, stained with ash, but still whole. She folded it and placed it in a cedar box beside the strong box that had somehow survived, too. The past didn't need to be erased, just remembered the right way. She stepped out onto the porch with Grace in her arms, the late sun casting long gold streaks across the field. Milo looked up from where he grazed near the new tree, ears perked. Grace giggled and reached for him, and Evelyn whispered, "Go on then." The child waddled across the yard, Milo already moving to meet her. Some said God had sent that donkey. Evelyn never argued. But deep down, she believed something simpler. Milo didn't need heaven's help to know what mattered most. What an incredible story of instinct and devotion. If Milo's courage touched your heart, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs a little miracle today. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of resilience from the American West. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.